Greetings, friends and fellow hobbyists and any mechaniacs lurking out there, and welcome to another episode of Sork's Mekshop. In the last episode, I showed you how I kit bashed my Big Mek and Mega Armour out of Necromunda Arachnorig and a lot of bits from my bits box. This week we'll be painting this chunky fella. Off camera, I also went ahead and threw together his Grot Oiler out of a Blood Bowl Goblin and some more 40k bits out of my bits box. There's a link to the kit bash video. First, I want to talk about some of the design goals from painting. Whenever I start a project, obviously, I want to think a little bit ahead of time about what I want him to look like. Not in too much detail, of course, but just, kind of big picture design goals. Obviously, he needed to have a blue color scheme because he is, of course, a Deathskulls Big Mek. He also had to unify with the rest of the army, but he doesn't want to look like he's made in the factory. He needs to be, battered, dirty, rusty, look like he's cobbled together. So with those in mind, I kind of picked out my palette of colors and had them out on the table. You want to have them nice and organized so that you can grab them as you want to and as you need to and be able to bounce between them as you go through different parts. You don't want to have to be fumbling around and looking for stuff in the middle of a paint job. The other thing I wanted to do with this one is I wanted to try something new. I've done a lot of different models for this army already. I've got well over 2,000 points. I think it's something close to 3,000 at this point. And every time I do a model, I want to try a new technique. I want to expand my toolkit a little bit, as it were. And I've tried a lot of different ways to do weathering before. One thing I haven't tried before, though, is a salt technique for doing rusting effects or doing paint chipping. I've done a bunch of other techniques for it before. I've done sponging, I've done chipping mediums, that sort of thing. And I've only watched salt used on videos, though. It's a technique that I'll show you in the video, but it comes once again from the fine scale model historical miniatures hobby. And I decided to try it for myself this time. At a high level, the way it works is you essentially lay down whatever the weathering looking things are going to be. So in our case, rust, or I guess what I should say is, excuse me, you lay down the colors that you want to have shown through once the paint would have flaked off. So like, for example, if you just want to show that metal has been revealed because paint's chipped off, then you would, paint a metal color down first. If you want it to be rusty, then you put the rust down first, and so on. So you put down whatever color you're showing first, then you apply the salt, and then you airbrush whatever the top color is, in my case blue. So the reason this works is because once everything's dry, you can essentially just kind of rub the salt off, and that will the salt essentially acts like a mask. We covered masking in a previous video, and so the nice thing about salt is that it forms really random patterns, and so you get a really random kind of organic effect. The one thing that I wanted to do as sort of an innovation is every video that I watched essentially just used regular old table salt, which meant that all the grains of salt were the exact same size. I kind of lucked out. I happened to have some really coarse grained salt in my kitchen from doing like a spice rub a while back. And so I decided, instead of using regular table salt, I was going to take my coarse grained salt and I was going to grind it up first. And so what I did was I ended up taking that and I ground it to different grits, if you will. So like how you have sandpaper that's different grits of sandpaper, different coarsenesses, if you will, of sand. I did that essentially with the salt. So I had some that were fully coarse, some that were kind of varying medium levels of coarsenesses, and some that were really fine. And then I threw all that into a jar, and as I sprinkled it onto my my Big Mek, I wound up with different thicknesses of salt in different places, which I was hoping, this was all experimental, I was hoping it would result in an even more random effect where some chunks were bigger than others. And well, you can judge for yourself. Let's get on to the video. I'm gonna do one other thing differently in this video, which is I'm actually gonna lead off with showing the finished product. So if you like me doing that, please let me know in the comments. If you don't like me doing that, please let me know in the comments as well. All right, let's get to it. Here you see a preview of the finished product of our Big Mek and his little Grot Oiler buddy standing side by side. For this, I'm actually shining a black light on the two models rather, inside of a little black surrounding. The black light is actually highlighting the fluorescent paint that I used as part of the paint scheme on the parts that are glowing, which I thought was kind of a cool effect. So we'll cover that a little later, how I did it in the painting tutorial itself. So moving over, we're starting off here airbrushing in some burnt umber ink, and this is starting off the dark base brown for the rust effects I was talking about during the intro. And I'm just kind of going quickly all over the model to give it just kind of a base tone of, like I said, just kind of a dirty brown everywhere to get started with. I think this is one of the areas I mentioned in the intro I was doing as a way to get it just started with kind of a grungy look to begin with. And I guess I said I didn't have the Goblin on camera, but I was wrong. I got him at least partially on camera. The frame that you see there, I did as sort of an experiment as a way to get a little more randomization in there, because the next paint I'm using is a burnt sienna, which is sort of a red brown. And so what I did was I took a dryer sheet and I glued it to a little bit of a sprue frame, and I was using that to randomize splatters, because when you shoot through something like that, the fibers are going to bounce the ink a little bit in different directions, and so it'll randomize where the splatters hit and where you end up having patterns and not patterns, that sort of thing. It didn't work great. It was another thing I was just sort of experimenting with and seeing how it worked. I think I might need something a little more stable to work properly. I then followed up with some matte varnish to kind of dull the shine down a little bit, which again wasn't the best. And then now here I'm going through with a bright orange, just another off-the-shelf artist orange. I don't remember the exact brand, but again, or I mean the exact pigment rather, but again, doesn't matter. Just whatever bright orange you like to get the brightest of the rust everywhere. And again, I'm just using a bit of sponge to create a little bit more randomness to it, some tweezers so that I can get into corners, and I'm just sort of dabbing wherever I feel like. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. It's just kind of splotching kind of anywhere that I think rust might show up, and where if I was doing an actual sponging technique to try to create the rust effects itself, I would probably make the sponge a little bit drier, and I'd be a little more careful about how I was placing it so the sponge itself was creating the random pattern. In this case, I don't really care as much with the sponge because it's just getting the small amounts in there. It's not actually creating the patterns by itself. Here's where I'm starting to apply a little bit of water using the sponge, and then a little bit of salt. And that jar there is where I have the mix of different grains of salt that I told you I'd ground up and then thrown in there and shook up in random patterns. And here, what I'm doing with the pinches, I'm just sort of digging around in there, getting pinches, dropping them in certain places that I think should have the rust showing through on the model. And I'm trying to be fairly careful. I'm trying not to cover it too heavily. I think that there's advantages and disadvantages to how heavy you want to go with it. The result just really depends on how rusted you want it to look and how much paint you want to have at the end of the day. So that scene jumps because I waited probably an hour or so. The amount of time you wait is really going to depend a lot on your local humidity conditions and temperature and all that kind of stuff. So for me, I just sort of waited about an hour and then just kind of did a visual scan, visual check to see how dry it looked, touched the salt a little bit to see if there's any water underneath it, anything like that, and then came back. And then I'm starting off with a dark blue. I'm using a dark blue. This one's I think it's ultramarine, might be a Prussian blue. I'm pretty sure it's ultramarine though. Ultramarine blue to start off with the base colors on the bottom, and then after that I came back with a brighter cerulean blue to get the parts that is going to be more hit by sunlight and make a brighter blue up top. And again, just going all over the model, just getting my my blue however I want it, wherever I want it. And then after that I added in a little bit of white to the cerulean blue to get the highest highlights that I wanted on the spots that are getting the most exposure. And just as a quick reminder, I might have covered in a previous video, I'm pretty sure I did, but the larger the thing is, the more sunlight it reflects, and so you want it to, if you're trying to give a sense of size, then you want to make something a little lighter than it might otherwise be in a bigger patch so that your eye thinks that it's a bigger thing. In here, I'm going through now with the metallic paint. In this case, I really like to use Duralumin, which is a Vallejo Metal Color Series paint. I use it pretty much for all my silver type metallics, and then if I want a different tone, I'll come back in with a wash, or I'll mix an ink in with it before applying it to change the tone a little bit. I can make just about anything. I can make a copper or a gold, blue metals, whatever with it. It's just a really good base metallic. And this is also where I sort of figured out, I'll cover this a little bit later on, but it's where I figured out that trying to use either a paintbrush or any really wet paint next to the salt doesn't really work great, because the salt's not on very solidly, and so actually painting, and as soon as you touch the salt, it knocks the salt right off because it's not on very solidly. So lesson learned there. We pick up things as we go with our experimentation, and this is one of the things I learned, is that if you're gonna paint anything, you want to paint it before you put the salt on. If you try to paint after the salt's on, you need to paint where the salt is not in existence. Otherwise, you're gonna knock it straight off. So just working my way around the model here, getting all the joints and all the ball bearings and all the metal parts that I wanted to have silver. And then, since they're not going to be weathered by the salt, I'm coming back in here with some various brown washes that I'm mixing together. I don't remember exactly which ones I'm using, but what my usual mix is going to be any kind of dark browns or red browns. So I'll use things like Warrior Flesh or Strong Tone, or a mix of Warrior Flesh and Strong Tone. I think in this particular case I'm using Warrior Flesh from the Army Painter. It's one of their contrast equivalent speed paints. And then sometimes I'll use it straight, and sometimes I'll mix in a contrast medium or any other kind of medium that sort of thins it out without changing the consistency. So again, time jump, and now everything's dry, and so I'm going back in with a toothbrush and I'm scrubbing all the salt off. It's interesting here, what surprised me is that you can get pretty aggressive with the toothbrush. It doesn't actually damage anything as long as you're using like a soft toothbrush. Obviously I'm not going to use like a wire brush. This is just a regular soft cheap toothbrush, and you just go everywhere. In some places it actually requires the pressure to actually get the salt off, especially in some of the tighter crevices. The one downside is that was a piece that I realized as I was cleaning I had not actually pinned, whereas I pinned most of the rest of the places with the metal wire with the paper clips. So I ended up having to come back in and repin it later on and reglue it. Once I got done with all the salt, I came back in again and did a little bit of dry brushing of the highlights. This is just a very simple universal highlight where I took a pale sand kind of color. You can also use like a Titan buff or a Wraithbone or anything like that. Essentially what you're looking for is like an off-white, because it's a nice way to kind of unify a lot of your highlights, especially when you have a color like a light blue. So that's what I did, where I went through and just sort of went all over the model to give myself a nice universal highlights of a lot of the edges. And then I came back through and started blocking out some of the darker colors like the blacks, and then later on you'll see me get into some of the greens and whatnot with, in this case I ended up using Black Templar contrast as a way to black out the cables and whatnot. And if you see the cables I'm using here, those are the ones that I made out of the green stuff in the previous video when I used my textured plastic card to create those patterned cables. The other thing I'll point out here is a little trick I've learned from, I think it was Ninjan. So shout out to Ninjan. I know he's done this technique. I don't remember if he's the first person that showed me, but if you notice the small paintbrush I have there, I've got the wrap around it. I'll show you how I put it on in a later clip, but essentially what that is that's a self-adhesive medical tape. And so it's like what they use for bandages. It doesn't stick to anything except for itself. But what's nice about it, and I think Ninjan points out that he learned about it from the tattoo industry, but because it sticks to itself, you don't have to worry about any glue residue getting anywhere or anything like that. But by wrapping your paintbrush with it, your fingers don't have to squeeze quite as small, into position to hold the brush, and so it's a lot easier to do fine detail work in a long painting session without having muscle fatigue in your fingers. And so it's easier to maintain control over, the fine tips and things like that when you're painting for long periods of time. So I gave it a try a couple of projects ago, and I really liked it. I don't use it for all my paintbrushes, but when I get into like the anything smaller than like a 1.0 brush, I think it's just really useful as a way to help me maintain stability and avoid muscle fatigue. So that's why you sit on this one. And then, like I said, in a later clip, when I get into some really fine detail, you'll see me do it on one of my even smaller brushes. And for that one, I think that's the first time I used one of the really super fine detail brushes, or rather, it will be a new brush that I'm using that I hadn't wrapped yet. So I'll actually on camera show you how I wrap it, and so you'll be able to see how that's done. They're super cheap too, those tapes. I think I got like maybe 24 of them for less than $10 on Amazon, and then I ended up giving half of them to a buddy of mine so that he could do the same thing. But anyway, as I said, I'm kind of working around the model here, just getting all the stuff that I want to have black, all the cabling and stuff. There's actually, on this model, there's a ton of little cables and wires and things like that all underneath the armor plates and the guts and whatnot. So once that's done, while it's drying, I move in, and I got I think it's a cadmium green from, once again, the artist range over at the art store, and I'm using that as my base coat for my orc flesh. One of the topics that I've seen come up a lot, especially on online forums, I think like the orc subreddit, a lot of people talk about, like what recipe do you use for your flesh? And I think I talked about this in my Happy Little Orcidents video, but I really despise talking about recipes for flesh because, let's be honest, among human beings, there is no flesh tone recipe, right? Like, none of us have the exact same flesh tone. Even people who are of the exact same ethnicity, or for that matter, even in the same family, don't have the exact same skin tone, skin pattern, whatever you want to call it. Somebody's got more freckles than somebody else. Somebody's been burned in the sun more than somebody else. Somebody's more tan than somebody else, whatever. And so I just, for miniatures, I see absolutely no point in trying to make the exact same skin tone for even any two models in your army, much less the same skin tone as box art or somebody else's army. So I will never try to replicate the exact same skin tone when I'm painting my models in my armies. I will generally, for my orcs, for example, I might grab the same paints for more than one model, especially if I'm doing a batch like for a squad, but I'll never apply them in the exact same way. I will never apply them in the exact same consistency. I'll sometimes even use different brush strokes as I apply them, because even those like subtle variations as you go provide a little bit of visual interest. They apply a little bit of variation, and I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, but I just feel like that allows for even a little bit of verisimilitude and a little more lifelike result, personally. Now, I mean, I haven't won any awards, so maybe I'm completely off base and I'm off my rocker, but that's the way I look at it. I just feel like each of my little dudes is slightly more unique and individual as a result of that. So in this case, I think this is this is the second time I've used this particular brand of green on an orc. I picked it up just a few weeks ago, and the first time I used it was on the Goblin Assistant, or Gretchen Assistant rather, and the second time was on his boss. And even in both cases there, for the Gretchen Assistant, as I was working up his highlights, I applied a lot more of the yellow as I was going up from the green than I did with the boss, and I applied a lot less of the shadow tone to the Goblin than I did, or the Gretchen, than I did to the Big Mek. So they're going to have different skin tones, which you may or may not have picked up on during the rotation, and you may or may not notice. I challenge you to look at it when I do the closing rotation and see if you can notice any differences between their skin. I can when I see them in person, but I'm curious if you guys see them or not. Like I said, it's just a personal habit of mine, and I encourage you to explore your art that way too. I mean, think about whether or not it's worth your headaches to try to match something that somebody else is doing, or even to try to keep track of what you're doing project to project. or if it's cooler to allow for some variation and to allow each project to be a little more creatively unique, so that you're less hung up on being perfect and just more enjoying the process. And here I am just kind of continuing to work up the skin tones to the next level. A little more highlights as I go. Small scratchy strokes. That's the other thing too. Like if you're aiming to provide yourself complete coverage on every pass, then I think you're also missing an opportunity to create some personality in your painting as well. I remember when I was first starting painting, it was all about getting everything as smooth as possible. But once again, real life is not smooth. Real life is, scratchy and dinged up, and it's, it's got bug bites and it's got zits and everything else. So why should your miniatures be any different? Have a little bit of variation, a little bit of scratchiness, a little bit of imperfection. The next step here, again, this is after the main coats are dry. I'm going in with my oil washes that I love so much. For those of you who've been watching my videos for a while, you know how much I love oil washes. And in this case, I'm going in with the burnt sienna again. Once again, burnt sienna is one of my favorite colors, both in acrylic and in, excuse me, that's the burnt sienna. The first one was burnt umber. I was gonna say burnt sienna, though, in specific, is one of my favorite colors, both in acrylic and in oils, just because it's got a really nice earthy red brown to it, like kind of a clay almost. And then in this case, I went ahead and added the burnt umber because I wanted to darken it down just a little bit, kind of like, in my imagination, it's sort of the kind of like the clay mixing together with maybe some of the oil that's leaking out of the part of the body, and they're all kind of mixing together and getting everything gummed up. So, I apply a little imagination as to why these colors got where they are. And just going through real quick, I've showed you the panel lining technique before, but for those of you new to the channel, what I'm doing essentially is I mix it up to a very thin wash consistency, and you take a little, what's called a liner brush in the art industry, and essentially it's like a fine detail brush, but the bristles are extra long. And what that allows for is it allows you to suck up a lot of paint into the bristles, and then when you touch the tip of it to, well, at least in this application, there's other reasons for this design in other applications of art, but specifically when it comes to panel lining, when you touch the tip of the liner brush to a crevice of any kind, any level of detail on your model, all that wash that's been soaked up into the bristles will, through what's called capillary action, just kind of drain out into the crevice, and it'll just kind of follow, because it's got a very low surface density, it'll just kind of follow along the cracks. And if you haven't tried it yet, I highly encourage you to try it. It looks like magic the first time you've done it. It's so much easier than a regular wash, in my opinion, and the results look great. And so you just kind of do it very quickly, going around, tapping through it. This video is obviously accelerated, but the unedited version of it is only about twice as long, not too much more than twice as long. So I think the entire panel lining of this entire model was less than 5 minutes. So it's a very, very quick process. And then what you'll do, you'll see later in the video the cleanup process, but essentially you'll go through the panel lining, you'll let it sit for a while, and once again, depends on temperature and everything else, and also what effect you're going for. But generally speaking, if all I'm trying to do is a little bit of weathering like I'm doing here, I'll do the panel lining, and then I'll let it sit for like 20 to 30 minutes. If I'm doing batch painting, maybe it's while I'm doing the other batches, or the other models in the batch, but let it sit for 20 to 30 minutes, and then you start doing your cleanup. And what that'll do is it'll give the paint time to settle, and it'll also give anything you're going to rub off or clean up, it'll give it time to stain just a little bit. And you want that staining effect to happen, because that's part of what gives it a little extra character in the surrounding areas. So here's the cleanup part. All I'm doing is I'm taking really dry makeup applicators. These are the sorts of things you might use for your eyeshadow, if you're a person that applies eyeshadow to themselves, or if you have a partner that does, or a friend, brother, sister, whoever that uses eyeshadow. You just take those sorts of applicators. They're pretty cheap, and you go through and you're literally just kind of wiping across the surface of the area that you did the panel lining in. Now, if you press into that area, then you're going to wipe it out of the area that you put the thing in. So you don't want to necessarily press really hard in there. You're really just kind of wiping off the surface. So essentially what you're doing is you're cleaning the flat panels around the line that you were trying to darken up, if there's a spot there that you don't want to have a stain of some kind. Now, again, this is intended to be weathering, so it's entirely possible in your imagination that what is there is some oil or some dirt or whatever that kind of got stuck there, in which case, don't clean it off. It's perfectly fine. This is your model, and I'm not your dad, so I'm not going to tell you how to clean your models. What I was doing here, though, was exactly what I just said, which is I was trying to take the spots that didn't look like they should be there to me, based on what I was trying to achieve, and wipe them off. And I did a similar thing with a lot of the cabling, because the cabling, in my experience from time in the field with industrial, or not industrial, but like construction machinery and things like that, vehicles, tanks, etc., is that a lot of times even the cabling, like hydraulic lines and things like that, will get kind of a layer of grime on them. So I went ahead and applied that same, kind of dark brown, red brown wash to them, and then kind of wiped it off, but I didn't wipe it off too much, so that's why a lot of the control cables and things like that still look kind of darker than they did when I first painted them. I'm going through now here, and I'm doing white. So a lot of people, when they think of panel lining, they're thinking just of weathering. They're thinking just of that darkening down of, wash. Washes in general in the hobby of miniature painting is about creating spots of darkness. You can do the same thing with whites, and that's what I'm doing here. For those of you who haven't done this before, haven't thought of it before, you might be asking yourself, well, why am I making a low spot white? Well, it's because these spots are eventually going to be the glowy bits. And so by making myself a wash out of the white ink, or excuse me, not ink, the white oil, I can do the same panel lining technique, but out of white, and that's going to give me a nice bright backdrop that I can now go through and put this light fluorescent blue into, and it'll give it a brighter pop than it would have had if I'd left it that kind of dark, grungy look that it started off with. Now the technique I'm using on the globes here, I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out how I was going to do those, because I've always had a hard time with those rounded surfaces, trying to make them look good, especially because where do you highlight, where do you how do you shadow them, all that kind of stuff, especially if you want them to look like they're kind of glass and lit from within, which is what I wanted here. So what I ended up doing was I took that fluorescent and I thinned it just a little bit with some gloss medium and some water, and then I went through and I'm panel lining the small glowy bits, but for the globes themselves, I took a fairly large brush and I just kind of slopped the paint on. I wasn't really trying to paint it smooth. I just kind of slopped it on in a really rough pattern. It was really just kind of a random swirly kind of motion. You can back up the video and watch it again. I know it went kind of quick, but it was just a very, very rough spot. I was not trying to get full coverage. In fact, I was sort of relying on the fact that I wasn't getting full coverage. If you watch while I'm doing these panel linings, you can see that there's like very clearly white spots showing through. I'm not going to fix that. I'm leaving that way on purpose. I was going for a kind of, swirly blue marble, almost like you see if you look at the Earth from space. And again, this was completely experimental. I wasn't sure if it was going to look like crap, if I was going to have to repaint it later, but end result I thought looked all right. So I just went again for kind of a big brush, kind of a swirly, sloppy a pattern effect to it that was fairly random, and then surrounding the other areas with that same fluorescent blue into the lines around it, which I can then reinforce with more traditional paints, and lightening up the fluorescent, thinning it out a little bit more, creating some more layers of things, which I'm doing here as I mix that in together with some contrast medium to get some flow, some variance in flow to it, going through and just finding other spots of the model that I think might benefit from looking like they're glowing. It's, again, not really a science. I'm not a plasma scientist, so I'm sort of trying to figure out what parts of this weapon might be having plasma energy running through it or leaking out of it. Again, this is an Orc Big Mek, so I'm not sure even he knows how it works. So just trying to figure out what might look cool as I go through there and pick stuff out. And then on the pylons leading up there too, one thing that I thought was kind of interesting was that when I did that first wash of the white ink, or excuse me, I keep saying ink, the first wash of the white oil, there was actually a seam where the two parts of the pylons came together and where I glued them together. And I thought it had sealed really well, and I'd sanded it when I first did the kit bash, but it actually hadn't quite sealed perfectly, and so there was actually a little bit of a line of white there, which I actually thought ended up looking pretty cool because it looked like it's leaking energy. So, go back to my happy little Orcidence video. It's not always something you plan that you end up liking about your model. Anyway, jumping forward, the next step that I'm doing here, I'm going through and putting like a dot of white ink that's been mixed with some contrast medium just in the center of each of those smaller globes that are on the Necron parts of the gun. And the reason for that is just because I wanted to make them look like they were just white hot as you look at them from a distance. And by this point in the design, I actually hadn't figured out the part about using a black light to make everything look like it was glowing in photographs. But also, when I play the game, I'm not going to have a black light glowing on my models all the time, so I wanted to have some way of making sure that folks know these things are supposed to be glowing hot. So you go in there, you have the darker blue parts are going to be where the thing's not quite as hot, and then you get all the way to the bright white where it's literally glowing white hot. And so that's why I'm sort of layering up thin layers of white. The thing to remember here is that the thinner layers are going to look really bright when you first put them on, and then you're going to have to do more layers in order to actually keep them bright by the time they dry. What I'm doing here now is adding in a layer of gloss varnish, and again, that's to sort of sell the idea that these things are actually some form of glass or clear spheres on the back of his pylons there, and then also to provide kind of a layer of separation before I start painting in these little lightning bolts. And the lightning bolts are tricky to do. I hadn't done those in a while, so I took this tiny little, I think it's like a 10/0 artist brush, and you'll see here, this is the one I was talking about earlier that I get tired of holding, and I decided to eventually swap out to add the tape to, because my fingers started getting cramped. And so you'll watch me put that on here in a second. But painting lightning bolts, I might do a separate video on it at some point. Painting lightning bolts is pretty simple when you get down to it. The tricky part is just making sure that you have stability in the model and in your hand when you're doing it. So I've got the model resting on the table, I've got my hand resting on the table with the model, and then my paintbrush hand is resting on my hand, which is resting on the model. And I guess I didn't capture on camera very well, but that's where I put the tape on. Anyway, lightning bolts, the trick with them is randomness. So, well, I guess semi-randomness is the best way to put it. You want each little lightning bolt segment should be kind of scratchy and random. I think that a lot of people make the mistake of trying to make perfect forks out of them, but if you look at lightning bolts in nature, there is forking that happens, but each fork is not a perfect Y kind of split off the previous fork. It's not like you're making a series of letter Ys, which a lot of people do when they draw them. Instead, there's just a lot of zigzagging happening. There's a lot of like small secondary things that come off. Some of them are thicker than others. So I think the trick to them is really just kind of getting in there and just kind of scratching, hither and thither. But, you always have to connect back to a previous branch somehow. So that's kind of what I would advise, is just kind of get in there, zigzag a little bit, try to connect back. And if you end up with a part that's well, let me back up. You go with a thinner paint. not one that's so thin that it's going to run, but a thinner paint so that when it dries, it's kind of translucent. And then that way you can reinforce the arcs that you like, and the ones that you don't reinforce look like they're more in the background, if that makes sense. And if you end up with one that's too wide, not a big deal. You can reinforce parts of it, and then the parts you don't reinforce might even look like they're just a glow off the ones you did reinforce. So again, I'll probably cover this more in detail in another video, but random, small, choppy, that's the goal, not necessarily perfect forks or perfect lines or anything like that. A lot of like little short, scratchy, stabby kind of motions with your brush is much more effective in my experience. And then here we're finishing up with another layer of the, well, actually a quick glaze of the fluorescent, and then we'll do another layer of the gloss. And that pretty much wraps him up. So once again, the finished product of the rotation, and then we're going to actually turn off the main light and go straight to the black light, which I think looks even cooler. As you can see, all the parts that I had painted with a little bit of fluorescence, which included some of the stuff in the backpack. I also didn't realize until I actually shot this scene that I'd used some of the I can't remember the name of it now, but there's like a Necron glow paint from the GW line, and I didn't realize that that's also a fluorescent because I used it for part of the snot on the Gretchen. And when the black light came on and the main light went down, you could see his snot glowing, which I thought was kind of cool, and like I said, hadn't previously realized it. For joining me. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I'm going to publish a video that's a little bit more focused on using salt for weathering in a future video, but let me just cover a few things that I learned in the experiment on the Big Mek today. First of all, patience is a virtue. You want to make sure that everything is completely dry, to include any paint or water that you're using to bind the salt, before going on to the next step. It goes a long way to making sure the effect works better, because any amount of liquid is going to disrupt any salt that's already down there, and any amount of liquid that you put down while the first step is still drying is going to bind together. So in my case, it actually worked out kind of cool, because where I had accidentally put where there was some wet paint down when the salt went down, it actually kind of fused together and made it look like it was just some more corrosion that was like under the paint. So for my purposes, it worked out pretty well, but in the cases of paint chipping that you just want to have as chipping, and you don't necessarily want the metal under the paint to look like it's corroded, it might ruin the effect for you. So you don't necessarily want to have the salt mixed with wet paint, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You just want the salt to be stuck to the dry paint with water. I hope that makes sense. The second point I want to make is that any use of a paintbrush after the salt's down, even if the salt's completely dry, it's going to disrupt it. Whether your brush is wet or dry, the salt is on there with a very, very light amount of binding. You're going to knock it off. Similarly, if you go in hard with an airbrush, the high, especially if the airbrush is at a high pressure, you're going to knock the salt off. So you want to be at a low pressure with the airbrush, or at a kind of far standoff distance, so you don't knock it off too much. The water binds the salt to the model, but it's not a really, really strong bind. You're not talking about glue or anything like that. The last thing, I'm kind of curious about this one, so I'll experiment with it when I go and do my standalone video, is that I think doing more layers are going to look better. I did one layer of salt for this model, mostly for speed, but I think that while this one worked out okay, I think actually building up more and more layers is probably going to look better. And so what I'm thinking I might try is start off with like a layer that's just, my favorite metal color of whatever it is, and then do a salt layer, and then maybe add in a layer of paint over that salt layer that is, let's say a primer color of some kind, or maybe a dark brown. And then once that dry, add another layer of salt on top of that that's, separate from the first salt layer. And then when that's dry, add another layer of probably my rust effects from there, like the red browns and the oranges. And then once that's dry, more salt, and then my blue on top. And then once all that's dry, then I go ahead and clean it off. And I think that would add a lot more visual interest overall. I think it would look a lot more organic, a lot more natural, like something's actually like a rusting heap out there in the desert somewhere. We'll find out. Tune in whenever I publish that. Hopefully it'll be within the next few weeks. And like I said, I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to like and subscribe and tell all your friends. Have a great day.